starting into part B, and so we're moving on to some other antimicrobials. This section, we're going to talk about a couple of drugs that act similarly to penicillins. So I'm kind of grouping them at the beginning here together. Cephalosporins. So yes, indeed, we have antimicrobials for fish. They typically come in capsules and you put them in the water. You don't have to pill a fish. And that's how they get their antibiotics. So in addition to be able to just tolerate them in their gastrointestinal system, they have to be able to live in them too, or in the presence of them. Anyway, so cephalosporins are also beta-lactam antimicrobial. So they have that beta-lactam ring just like the penicillins do. Something that differentiates them from the penicillins is that they are classified by generation. And what that has to do with is there was a first generation that came out. It wasn't called that because there was only those group of drugs at the time. And then over time, some other cephalosporins came out. That was called the second generation. And then there's a third, and there's a fourth and a fifth. But we're only going to talk about the first and the third because those are the ones that are used in veterinary medicine. But you need to know, this is just one of the distinguishing things about this particular class of drugs, is that they occur in generations. And similarly to penicillin, we had in the penicillin area section I was talking about, there are penicillinases and there are beta-lactamases. And both of those enzyme types from the bacteria will attack the penicillin. In the case of cephalosporins, beta-lactamases will attack these same drugs. They seem to be less susceptible to them, but there is some resistance that does develop in bacteria due to these enzymes destroying the ring structure of the cephalosporins. But there are also enzymes that we call cephalosporinases, and they don't attack the penicillin, they only attack cephalosporins. And again, they target that ring structure, so just need to be familiar with the different terms that we use. So the mode of action is similar to penicillin. Cephalosporins interfere with the construction of the cell wall. It doesn't hold water, literally, and so the cell will rupture. So these are the first generation cephalosporins. Some examples are, these are the most common ones that we use, is cefadroxil, otherwise known as cephadrops. So this is the generic name, remember, and these are the trade names. And cefapirin, which is cephalac and cephadry, probably associated with the dairy industry and drying off lactating animals and infections that may occur at those times. And then we have some human products, cephalexin, otherwise known as Keflex, and cefazolin, Kefzol. Keflex is one that you will see in clinics. It's very commonly used. It is very cheap, so we tend to use it in some of the larger animals for susceptible type of infections. So the second and third generations of cephalosporins, they tend to shift in their spectrum of activity. They tend to target more gram-negative bacteria than the first generation and less gram-positive. So they kind of shift in their spectrum of activity. Remember the gram stain on the bacteria, and it will just indicate whether the outer coating is there or not. That may take a little bit more to get into. So the gram stain, if it's gram negative, that means that it just has a different outer coating to get through. So anyway, very generally, that's what happens with the second and third generation. So as we get to the third generation, it is even more gram negative effective. We don't tend to use the second generation cephalosporins. The third third generations, though, are used a lot. So Ch.10f is otherwise known as Naxel, and this is used in livestock. It's an injectable, and you don't need to use it as often as some other injectables. That's why it became very popular when it came out, but it was also very expensive when it came out. So it wasn't used on every cow or sheep or goat. Um, Cefidoxime is Ch.10f, and Ch.10f is a once a day antibiotic. And some of the more common, these treat skin infections a lot, skin, ear infections, urinary infections, and most of the other antibiotics when this came out were 2 or 3 times a day antibiotics. So this was a major advantage of this drug when it came out. That's why it's called Ch.10f. It's simple. You just give it once a day. And similarly, cefovizin or Convenia is also named because it is convenient. This one you can give, this one is used a fair amount for pretty deep-seated pyodermas because the convention is to give antibiotics for about 3 to 4 weeks minimum for a deep-seated skin infection. So this one lasts for 1 to 2 weeks, and it's an injection. And so the animal just needs to come back in every couple of weeks. It kind of has an advantage that the veterinarian is going to see the animal again, and the owner doesn't have to remember to give the antibiotics every day, which is a lot to do for a month or more. So again, the name kind of gives it away. Convenia. It's sort of like Serenia, but in this case, it's convenient because of that. So as you've probably noticed, most of the members of this family of drugs begins with Ceph, spelled with a PH, or Ceph, spelled with an F. Many of the third generations are injectable. Simplicef is an exception. It is an oral drug. And there are other products available, but they're very expensive. And so these drugs have been on the market for a while and are not as expensive as the newer ones that come out, but just there will be more and more new generations. It's just the way it is. There is a fourth and fifth generation already. So these are not, you might have guessed that because we do have mostly injectables, that these drugs don't survive very well in gastric acid. So cephalexin and then Simplicef are two examples. The Keflex and Simplicef are two examples that do survive in gastric acid, and so they're given orally. But most of them are injectable. Food can interfere with the oral ones, so you just need to make sure that you know that and let owners know, and just look at it before you dispense it. Some of the programs will automatically, some of the labeling programs will automatically know some of the ones that can't be given with food. In general, cephalosporins are widely distributed, but they do not get into the cerebral spinal fluid. They don't get through the blood-brain barrier, so we don't use them for central nervous system type of infections. I'm not going to have you know this, but just metabolism is through the liver. But the important thing to know is the excretion, because similarly to penicillins, these are actively secreted and filtered into the renal tubules. And so there's a high concentration in the urine, so they can be used for bladder or kidney infections. They are excreted in milk, so of course we have to withhold that milk from going in with all the other milk that could leave the dairy. And of course, they cross the placenta. So just want to bring that up. So just like penicillins, there is a potential for hypersensitivity. It's less common than what we see in penicillins. But it's important to note that if an animal reacts to these, this family of drugs, that they may well react to penicillins. So there is this cross reaction, and so it's not just within the family of cephalosporins, it also can be in penicillins. So you just want to have that in the record so that an animal does not get exposed to them, to these drugs, again, if it does have a reaction to them. Typical reactions, just like the penicillins: fever, rashes, eosinophilia, and it can progress to anaphylactic shock. So some side effects, aside from that one, that's a pretty big one, but we can get superinfection by overgrowth. So the first generation oral can kill off the good bacteria in the GI tract, and then we get overgrowth and we can get life-threatening diarrhea. We also need to note, just like penicillins, because we have to have actively dividing colonies of bacteria that we're treating, we cannot use it with a static drug. And an example is chloramphenicol, but some of the tetracyclines do this too. They can't be given together because they will decrease the growth, and then that affects cephalosporin's mode of action, which is to interfere with the cell wall construction as it's being constructed. Some other fairly common side effects are my favorite here, VAD. I have them out of order, but vomiting, anorexia, and diarrhea. Not uncommon for owners to call about Keflex, cephalexin, and say that their animal has started throwing up, and they're wondering if it's the drug. So that is not uncommon. Sometimes it will not continue with another dose or so, but quite often we just get them in and put them onto a different drug. That doesn't happen with the injectables. So I have some questions. I'm just going to be putting them in the PowerPoint. I'm going to ask you a question to answer in D2L, but these are good study questions. So what is the mode of action for cephalosporins? List 3 distinguishing characteristics of cephalosporins, and then what are important side effects. And if you do this with the drugs in these presentations, you're going to be well off, because you're gonna create like a little portrait of each family. And it's important to know these names as far as the similarity part of the name. So in this case, the first syllable in these drug names is ceph, and so that will identify it as a cephalosporin. And the same thing with penicillins, its "-cillin" is at the end of the word. So you can tell quite often what a drug is by its name. So it's important to know that as you go through and study these drugs. Okay, and I'm just going to touch on this one very quickly because it has a similar mechanism of action. It disrupts the cell wall and makes it so the cell will rupture in the bacteria, but it's a different mechanism. Doesn't matter what the mechanism is, it just disrupts the cell wall. So this group is called bacitracins. If we used it systemically, it is very nephrotoxic. So we tend to put it into topicals where it doesn't get into the system. It's just used on the outside of the body. It's quite often mixed with a couple of other ingredients, polymyxin B and neomycin, other antibiotics, and so it's sometimes called a triple antibiotic ointment. It's used in the human world, it's used in the animal world, and that's pretty much all I need to say about bacitracins. In your book, they list it kind of farther back in the chapter, but I like to put it together because of its mode of action.